I'm going to project myself sometimes quite loudly, just to make sure you're all still awake. I hope you don't find that too difficult. To exalt, enthrone, establish, and defend. To welcome home mankind's mysterious friend, wine, true begetter of all arts that be. Wine, privilege of the completely free. Wine the recorder, wine the sagely strong, wine, bright avenger of sly dealing wrong. Awake, Ausonian muse, and sing the vineyard song. Now I come here with something of a conundrum, and not just because I'm more used of talking about Belloc in pubs than in churches. And the conundrum is this: whom do you think of when you think of Belloc? For some he is a young man, perhaps riding on his chestnut cob monster, singing, arguing loudly. To other he is the older man, of occasional melancholy, atop a high hill by day, on the deck of the Nona perhaps at dusk, his gaze lost in far-off thoughts, reflecting perhaps on dissolution and the end of things. Some, when they think of him, hear his sonnets, others his songs of Sussex, some his humour, whether verse or prose, while others the sonorousness of his essays, like the mellow tones of a beautifully played cello, as Maurice Baring put it. Some delight in him for his historical certainties or his evocation of the past, others for his political or socio-economic expositions and theorising. He was, after all, an MP. Some are drawn to him because he encapsulates the faith which he believed was central to personal and societal sanity. Others are drawn to Belloc, the wanderer, or the sailor, delighting in his evocation of place. Some rejoice in his novels, others his topographical studies, his travel books. Just as E.C. Bentley famously complained in his Clerihew on Belloc, seldom has one man had so many parts. And those who delight in Belloc, for this reason or for that, if they're ever left in a room unattended, all eventually fall upon each other in disputation and argumentation as to which parts of Belloc are the greatest. For the fellowship of Bellocians can be as rowdy and argumentative as the man himself sometimes was. But one thing is common to all of these people: they all like a drop. And they would all gladly raise a glass in his name. And so what better subject is there to unite that fellowship of people who love and revere Belloc and his works than wine? Now, wine, of course, features quite regularly in Belloc's writings, often as much symbolically as actually. The master, which is how I fondly call Belloc, was clearly fond of the stuff, but he also knew that it carried in itself something eternal, much broader and deeper and richer and more significant than the delight it can bring to body, soul, and mind. He wrote of it practically, and he wrote of it as a cultural artifact, heavy with meaning. The first, the most essential canon is that wine of every sort, so long as it is pure, must be taken seriously as the chief element of life. It is the concomitant and perhaps the foundation of all our culture. Man without wine is an ox, said the wise man, and he was right. Man without wine is a boor. And of course, wine thematically connects all sorts of strands of Belloc's life: his French nationality, his travels, his love of history, poetry, song, his musings on the Catholic faith and Christian culture, his devotion to the liturgy and to Holy Mass. It even connects with his sailing, and not only because of the wine-dark sea upon which he sailed. And so through the medium of wine, we will draw, I hope, a little bit closer to Belloc and learn more of the man and his thought, and perhaps draw closer to resolving that conundrum. Which Belloc? Now, wine, of course, is to many an evocation of place. The French have this insistence upon the importance of a wine's terroir. It's a recognition that the vine draws in the genius loci of a place, so that the grapes it bears and the precious liquid that's then pressed from those grapes is a unique and local thing. And local things were so important to Belloc. A man so widely travelled, often on foot, who loved every place he saw and stayed because it was local and particular, and because he felt that genius loci of a place, and drew it into his lungs as he travelled, and he often drained it from a glass wherever possible. And how the heroic poem in praise of wine, with which I just opened my talk a few minutes ago, incants that love of particular place, even while taking us on a journey from Asia to the Atlas, and almost everywhere in between, in a classical travelogue sans pareil. Sing how the charioteer from Asia came, and on his front the little dancing flame which marked the Godhead. Sing the panther team, the gilded thyrsus twirling, and the gleam of cymbals through the darkness. Sing the drums. He comes. The young renewer of Hellas comes. The seas await him. Those Aegean seas roll from the dawning, ponderous, ill at ease in lifts of lead whose cresting hardly breaks to ghostly foam, when suddenly there awakes a mountain glory inland. All the skies are luminous, and amid the seabird cries the mariner hears a morning breeze arise. Then goes the pageant forward. The seaway silvers the feet of that august array, trailing above the waters through the airs, and as they pass, a wind before them bears the quickening word, the influence magical. The islands have received it, marble tall, the long shores of the mainland. Something fills the warm Euboean combes, the sacred hills of Aulis and of Argos, and still they move, touching the city walls, the temple grove, till far upon the horizon glint a gleam of light, of trembling light, revealed they seem turned to a cloud, but to a cloud that shines, and everywhere as they pass, the vines, the vines, the vines, the conquering vines, and the vine breathes her savour through the upland empty heaths of treeless wastes. The vines have come to where the dark Pelasgian steep defends the lair of the wolf's hiding, to the empty fields by Aufidus, the dry campaign that yields no harvest for the husbandman, but now shall bear a nobler foison than the plough, to where, festooned along the tall elm trees, tendrils are mirrored in Tyrrhenian seas, to where the south awaits them, even to where, stark, African, informed of burning air, upturned to heaven, the broad Hipponian plain extends luxurious and invites the main. Guelma's a mother, barren Thapsa breeds, and northward in the valleys, next the meads that sleep by misty river banks, the vines have struck to spread below the solemn pines. The vines are on the roof trees. All the shrines and homes of men are consecrate with vines. Now, what a magnificent sequence of vistas passes before our eyes, this merry and magical journey of the life-giving sun and the sun-kissed winds, from Anatolia all the way to the North African plateau, those winds that filled the sails of the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Carthaginians, and the Romans, even as it stirred the vine leaves and caressed the nimble fingers that picked the grapes. Now, I often muse that the well of joy within Belloc that never yet was dried was probably full of wine. Although whether it was full of his beloved wines of the Rhone, or Burgundy, or even of Orvieto Hill, of which but 2 glasses taken chilled are enough to make man immortal for a short time, I cannot say. He drank by choice from a silver goblet at home, something with shame I admit never to having done. There's almost something liturgical in that image, to which we will of necessity return when we come to consider the great subspecie aeternitatis. On board the Nona or the Jersey, he would often as not drink from a chipped enamel mug, something I have done, rather more than I'd like to admit. Now, Belloc was, of course, a Frenchman by birth, and to some extent by upbringing. He was naturalised as a British citizen only as late as 1902, at the age of 32 years. So the Belloc who wrote The Path to Rome was a Frenchman. The Belloc who wrote Danton and Robespierre was appropriately a Frenchman. But so was the Belloc who wrote The Bad Child's Book of Beasts. And he probably became British principally so that he could seriously consider a career in politics and stand for Parliament. but to his political enemies, as he found out when campaigning, he would always be French. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, it's therefore of French wine that he speaks most. And I don't just here refer to that delightful and weaving excursus on the wine of Brûlé that adorns the opening parts of the Path to Rome, where he goes on for page after page about this glorious wine that I'm sure if any of us were to drink it now, we might find it disappointing. Even when he muses on wine further afield, it's often of North Africa, to which the French had just returned the vine, as the Romans had brought it there so many centuries before, and where the glory of the French Republic, born ironically of an imperial dream, was manifest in newly planted vineyards, as in brand new railways and roads. He revels, as I do, in the red wines of Burgundy, particularly Courtin, Vosne Romanée, Richebourg, Louis Saint-Georges. He appears almost to scorn the white wines, for which I have to forgive him. It's a blemish on his record, which I think is quite significant. But then Evelyn Ward did say that Belloc's opinions on wine were strong and idiosyncratic to the verge of perversity. Belloc claims no specialist knowledge of clarets, that great English wine, if you like, or the wines of the Garonne, as he calls them, but he states that he is fond of them. I think this is because no man who has fallen in love with red Burgundy can ever love another red wine as much as he loves the wines of the Côte d'Or. But he does have this to say about the wines of Bordeaux. Claret is a doubtful thing. All the wines of the Garonne and of the Dordogne are as diverse as the souls and bodies of men. Some will live it out prodigiously for years, increasing in virtue with time, a process quite against the general order of things. Some die young and are soured by the wickedness of the world in their first bloom. Some with precocity attain ripeness early like the poets, and hang on like the poets doubtfully, preserving their main quality on into middle age, and then, like the poets, rapidly becoming intolerably dull, downright bad, and worthy of destruction, sometimes calling for vengeance. Others have so little substance in them that they rot from the first. Some few, some very few, are worthy to be called contemporaries with man himself. Now, Rhone wines he adores, even if he did blend them from time to time with Algerian red. And of white wines he prefers them sweeter than drier, which is very much a characteristic of the age in which he lived. But he doesn't like them too sweet. He does express a deep admiration for the dry wines of Fay on the Loire. But of sparkling wines, he will only admit those of Angers, Saumur, and Vouvray to be veritable wines. Champagne is to him a drug, not a wine. I dread to think what he would have thought of Prosecco. But he says champagne is invaluable when tired, and he drinks it to raise himself from the dead. A thing I constantly need, he says. And I'm sure we can share that thought from time to time ourselves. But what is the most French wine of all? It is that which is connected to perhaps one of the most French writers of all. I speak of François Rabelais, the abstractor of the quintessence, surgeon, monk, satirist, runaway friar, humanist and writer of the great books Gargantua and Pantagruel, one of those works of literature most beloved of the master. Rabelais' style, both as expressed in the original and as polished, prettified, glossed upon, adorned, enlarged, revivified, belustered, bejewelled, damascened, and rendered positively rococo by his first English translator, who was actually Scottish, Sir Thomas Urquhart, a royalist who fought at the Battle of Worcester, was locked up, and then translated these works while he was in prison. But the imitation of this style of Rabelais can be found throughout all of Belloc's works, most notably in the prologue to the Path to Rome, and in his great essay on the approach of an awful doom. And the wine of Rabelais was to Belloc the wine of France. This was the wine Chinon, a red to be drunk cellar cool, or after a short dip in the waters of the Loire. The wine, that is, not the drinker thereof. Try and find a bottle tomorrow, drink it. Failing that, find a bottle of Bourgogne or Saint-Nicolas de Bourgogne, which is from the next town along the Loire, and revel in it. In your quest for Bacbuc, the holy bottle which all of these books of Gargantua and Pantagruel written about the great search for the holy bottle that contained the great wine. Your quest for Bacbuk will then be over if you lift to your lips a glass of Chinon. And now the task of that triumphant day is reached to victory. In the reddening ray with all his train, from hard Iberian lands, fulfilled, apparent, that creator stands halted on Atlas. Far beneath him, far, the strength of ocean darkening, and the star beyond all shores. There is a silence made. It glorifies, and the gigantic shade of Hercules adores him from the west. Dead lucre, burnt ambition, wine is best. Now, Belloc wrote that making a custom of wine breeds an appreciation of truth, goodness, and beauty. And so he construed the ideological rejection of wine, and indeed of alcoholic beverages more broadly, as a sign of the devil's mischief, of man's fallen nature, his villainy and wretchedness, of something crooked in his very being that led him to despise a gift of God. And yet, to some extent, he had to accommodate himself with these people with these sorts of views, in order to further his political career. Now, his decision to seek the parliamentary constituency of South Salford as a Liberal candidate, the neighbouring seat to the seat of Churchill at the time, was probably taken in 1904, 2 years before the eventual election in which he won that seat. I believe that, notwithstanding his deep political interest, he was a man always who loved the matters of politics, that he also saw getting a seat as a means of making a better living for his family and selling more books. But he had a lot of winning over to do in his proposed constituency, not least from the core of liberals who were nonconformists in religion and supporters of the temperance movement, for many of whom the consumption of alcohol was not just a potential occasion of sin, as a Catholic like Belloc might have put it, but was evil in itself. Now, just as he famously placated those who were anxious about his Catholic faith, he managed to placate those who suspected him of inebriety, maintaining that he would fight against the big brewing industry, which was backed by his conservative opponent. But he would also, more quietly perhaps, fight for more relaxed opening hours and purer beer for the working man. Now, he knew that the temperance movement was an over-fastidious relic of Puritanism, become a bourgeois fad and luxury, and that the working man, and don't we all, when we work, need a good drop regularly to leaven what can be a difficult life. He was almost alone in his whole political party in supporting the Pure Beer Bill. Was that pure beer? Excellent. Which was a private member's bill which the Liberal government squashed, which is a familiar tale today. And he regularly spoke in other debates on licensing laws, opening hours, and pure beer, noting how easy it was for the rich to drink champagne at any time and in any place, whereas a glass of good beer for the working man was becoming more penned in by government regulation and capitalist control. Now, this support for the poor man's drop ate into his constituency party support. But at the election in 1910, he managed to retain his seat with a reduced majority. But across the country, his party lost 110 seats, so he actually did significantly better than most other of the Liberals. But anyway, later that year, in the second election of 1910, he decided to chuck it all in. Famously, he said, "I am glad to be rid of the dirtiest company it has ever been my misfortune to keep." And to think I'm still working in that place after 26 years. But what are these that from the outer murk of dense mephitic vapours creeping lurk to breathe foul airs from that corrupted well which oozes slime along the floor of hell? These are the stricken, palsied brood of sin, in whose vile veins, poor, poisonous and thin, decoctions of embittered hatreds crawl. These are the water drinkers. Cursed all! On what gin-sodden hags, what flaccid sires bred these white slugs, from what exhaust desires? In what close prison's horror Were their wiles watched by what tyrant power with evil smiles? Or in what caverns, blocked from grace and air, received they then the mandates of despair? What must our race, our tragic race, that roam all exiled from our first and final home, that in one moment of temptation lost our heritage, and now wander hunger-tossed beyond the gates, still speaking with our eyes forever of remembered paradise? Must we with every gift, accepted still with every joy, receive attendant ill? Must some lewd evil follow all our good, and muttering dog our brief beatitude? A primal doom inexorable, wise, permitted, ordered even these to rise, even in the shadow of so bright a Lord, must swarm and propagate the filthy horde. Debased, accursed, I say, abhorrent and abhorred, accursed and curse bestowing, for whosoever shall suffer their contagion everywhere falls from the estate of man and finds his end to the mere beverage of the beast condemned. For such as these in vain the Rhine has rolled imperial centuries by hills of gold. For such as these the flashing Rhone shall rage in vain its lightning through the hermitage, or level-browed divine Turenne receive the tribute of her vintages at eve. For such as these Burgundian heats in vain swell the rich slope, or load the empurpled plain. Bootless for such as these the mighty task of bottling God the Father in a flask, and leading all creation down distilled to one small ardent sphere, immensely filled. With memories empty, with experience null, with vapid eyeballs meaningless and dull, they pass unblessed through the unfruitful light. And when we open the bronze doors of night, when we in high carousal, we reclined spare up to heaven the still ascending mind, pass with the all-inspiring to and fro the torch of genius and the muses glow. They, lifeless, stare at vacancy alone, or plan mean traffic, or repeat their moan, when we, repose demands us, welcomed are in young white arms, like our great exemplar who, wearied with creation, takes his rest and sinks to sleep on Ariadne's breast. They through the darkness into darkness press, despised, abandoned, and companionless. And when the course of either sleep has run, we leap to life like heralds of the sun. We, from the couch in roseate mornings gay, salute as equals the exultant day, while they, the unworthy, unrewarded, they, the dank despisers of the vine, arise to watch grey dawns and mourn indifferent skies. Forget them! Form the Dionysian ring and pulse the ground, and Io, Io sing! Now, while Belloc was a Frenchman, he was also a classicist, not in a professional sense. He read history, not greats, when he was at Balliol, but by education and by cultural affinity. And the knowledge of Europe's classical heritage lies deep at the root of much of what he believed, what he understood, and what he wrote about. In this respect, it echoes much of what he said as an historian about the role of Rome in establishing, defending, and defining the European thing, and giving to our civilization the form and functions with which we are still familiar, not least in law, but also in politics of a sort, in war-making, in technology, and in the plastic arts. Where cities were built, where roads led and bridges fashioned, they're all part of the Roman work of Europe with which we still live. Some of this still lies hidden. Not far from where I live lies the second largest basilica in Roman Britain, at Caleva Atrebatum, Silchester, just outside of Reading. It lies hidden from view now beneath grassy hillocks where cows graze inside the broken down walls of that now deserted city. The largest basilica in Roman Britain was in London, and it was one of the very largest in the whole of Europe, and lies now also invisible beneath Leadenhall Market. But Belloc knew that the Roman thing was a thing of continuity. Silchester, like the city of Wroxeter or Viriconium, as it was known, was an anomaly, a statistical outlier, a Roman city that failed. Most of what Rome made is still with us, even if we don't know it. But it wasn't just the history of the classical world with which he was familiar. It was the culture of the worlds of Greece and of Rome. And as any fool know, culture is founded upon cultus, religion. And we'll touch upon the successor religion to classical paganism a little later. But no one could have written those opening stanzas of the heroic poem in praise of wine without being steeped in the myths and Weltanschauung of that world of antiquity. So many of the references in there, now to us obscure, would have been known, and not just amongst the most highly educated, for centuries on end. And some of what he wrote is now difficult for us to grasp. Now, I remember reading how, before a voyage, or each time perhaps he left harbour, upon the decks of his ship, Belloc would sometimes pour a libation of wine to the gods, often accompanied by the recitation of a couplet from Homer or from Virgil. This might seem an odd thing for a devout Catholic to do, but there are many strands to the life of the faith which reach back to one might call noble pagan instinct. And classical texts are, of course, replete with references to wine, as they are to the sea. All of those voyages in the great literary works of the Greek and Roman worlds, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, to name the three most obvious, are full of nautical journeying where landfall at home is often signalled by the sight of vines ashore, the vine being the manifestation of home and civilization. For the vine represents longevity of settlement, order, the hearth, where people tilled the soil for generations to draw from it the lifeblood for those who were to follow. Much as the vine symbolized to the Christian world the homeland of the faith, outside of which was the disorder of the vagrant barbaroi, the silent emptiness of the desert nomads, or the alien order of those civilizations of the East which had forsaken wine, so the vine to classical man was the sign of home. Now, how long does a newly planted vine need before it can produce wine really worth drinking? How long can a vine last? At what stage in its life does it produce its most concentrated grape juices, albeit from a dwindling annual harvest? These are things beyond a generation. For a vine truly to express itself from the terroir in which it grows, they're things of 2 or more likely 3 generations. Add to that the great tradition of laying down wines for one's children or one's grandchildren, of clearing land so that your children can plant their vines for wine for their grandchildren. And it is easy to see how deep the roots of that culture need to be to sustain the vine. This was a culture spread by Rome and Greece before it. Wine is home, wine is civilization, wine is continuity with tradition and order, and wine is also companionship, inns, taverns, friends beside a roaring hearth or at table. Now, as the phenomenon of wine stands on the classical origins of the west of Europe, which in Belloc's time was seen as embracing North Africa as well, between the Atlas and the Middle Sea, as the Romans had called it, so Belloc's interest in history was an interest in the story of the West, of how that classical civilization morphed into the world he knew. And there has probably never been an historical writer in this country so able as Belloc to conjure up time and place, and to set before the reader with such vividness a scene of long past as though it were one remembered, not fashioned. The sights, the sounds, the smells, and all drawn from contemporary texts, proximate narrative accounts, and from his understanding of the time and often of the place where that scene was set. It's not my task now to speak of Belloc and history, but his capacity to see the world now and to see it then, and to make connections between the two and to ascribe similarity and difference, to gauge the whys and wherefores for those likenesses and those dissimilarities, is a key part of his genius as a writer and a thinker. Now, were I now to set before you a bottle of Clos de Vougeot, were I fortunate enough to have such a bottle, what would you see? Now, here is a wine, even beyond the expense of most other Burgundies, fashioned from grapes grown in land enclosed by the monastic wall of a Cistercian holding, managed by the monks of Citeaux, that order's mother house. That land was passed to that order in the 12th century and was land already planted with vines on a site that dates back for such use to the Merovingian period, and probably prior to that. When I see that glass, when I pull the cork, pour the liquid, say a white clos, golden and buttery, into that glass, I can hear the chanting of the monks. I can see their robed figures among the vines, while below on that road from Beaune to Dijon march armies, Merovingian, then Carolingian, Burgundian, royal, then republican French. I see the chainmail, the guerdons, and then the plate armour and the chivalric colours and the blossoming of heraldry. I see the white frock coats of the Frederiциan wars of the so-called Enlightenment, and then the vivid blue of the republican armies. How expressive is just that one glass? Imagine what a whole bottle would do. And so was wine to Belloc, a messenger from Clio, the muse of history. And then we come to the hill of Courtin and to Charlemagne, when he with his wide host came conquering home from vengeance under Roncesvalles taken. Now, it's not always possible to distinguish legend from history, nor is it always desirable. As the master often pointed out, local folk tales about a place often record in embellished form something which sober narratives of that time omit to speak of, or speak of only in adumbration, but which are true in their own way. Charlemagne stood atop Courtin Hill. Some say it was already royal land, having been imperial land under Rome, on his way back from fighting the Saracen, as the Chanson de Roland records. Vines were already there, not covering all of the hill. They're recorded in a chronicle dating to 696 AD. They were no doubt Roman in origin. He stood, the wind in his white beard and hair, and in a vox clara et alta, that high voice and clear as Joinville has it, a description that makes me think of Belloc's voice, declared the wine of that hill to be his favourite, and he ordered casks of it to be brought to his train before setting off for his capital in the north. Now, if you win the lottery, seek out a bottle of Courtin Charlemagne, or Charlemagne. They're not inexpensive, as befits a wine fashioned for an emperor. They're white wines, although reds designed as Courtin or Alax Courtin are grown lower down on that hill. His wife, it is said, preferred him to drink white than red, as it would not fleck his beard. Or when his bramble beard flaked with foam of bivouac wine cups on the Lombard plain, what time he swept to grasp the world at Rome. And when, as I was saying, if you get the chance, if you buy that expensive bottle, you drink that white, think of Charlemagne atop that hill, on his horse, Tansandeur, with his sword, Joyeuse, at his side. Carolus Magnus, great king and war leader, first Holy Roman Emperor, the greatest figure of his generation and of many generations to either side of him. Father Linnaean, to whom our strength belongs, our loves, our wars, our laughter, and our songs, remember our inheritance, who praise your glory in these last unhappy days when beauty sickens, and a muddied robe of baseness fouls the universal globe. Though all the gods indignant in their train abandon ruined man, do thou remain. By thee the vesture of our life was made, the embattled gate, the lordly colonnade, the woven fabric's gracious hues, the sound of trumpets, and the quivering fountain round, and indestructible the arch, and high the shaft of stone that stands against the sky, and last the guardian genius of them all, rhyme, come from beyond the world to conquer time. All these are thine, Linnaean. By thee do seers the inward light discern, by thee the statue lives, the gods return. By thee the thunder and the falling foam of loud Aquarius' torrent call to Rome. Alba rejoices in 1,000 springs, Gensano laughs, and Orvieto sings. But with Orvieto, with that name of dark Etrurian subterranean flame, the years dissolve. I am standing in that hour of majesty septembral, and the power which swells the clusters when the nights are still with autumn stars on Orvieto Hill. For to drink wine is to drink history. Think of the wines of the Rhone Valley, quite possibly the first part of France to be brought vines by the Greeks, perhaps by the Phoenicians before them. On those steep baked hills of Cornas and Côte-Rôtie, the vintners still use caves there delved, wherein are stone vats to store and then press those grapes, vats that were there at least in Roman times, perhaps before. Think of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, a living memorial of the Avignonese papacy, called at its time by those who lamented the departure of the popes from Rome, the new Babylonian captivity, a phenomenon of the 14th century which blessed, if that is the term, a part of what is now France, then the Holy Roman Empire, with the seat of the popes for some 67 years. And among those popes was John the 22nd, known to his enemies as the Fat Pope of Cahors, although history records him as being rather slight, who brought to this area his local grape variety. He could not travel without it, Tannat, in order to have close to hand the black wine he enjoyed so much in his youth. For the Catholic Church and the history of Europe are of course interwoven, and the church and wine likewise, more existentially still. The white monks and their lay brothers toiling in the vineyards at Clos de Vougeot were an offshoot of the black monks, the Benedictines, who were themselves possibly the primary inheritors of the Roman thing in Europe, learning, rhetoric, reading, writing, arithmetic, grammar, agriculture, science. And as the power of local imperial rule weakened, that rule in the cities passed to the local bishop, who took over management of the diocese, a Roman term, which the Romans had ruled, and the great rural estates in the countryside, the latifundia, were increasingly passed on to the new monastic houses, which sprung up through the 7th and 8th centuries. The word basilica denoted where a Roman magistrate would sit to hear cases and give judgments, and is now associated with the church, as so many of those basilicae became churches as the empire became Christian and the church replaced the empire. Just as the central doors of St. John Lateran in Rome were taken from the old Senate house in the Forum, and the Pantheon was renamed and remade as the Church of Mary and the Martyrs, so the ceremonies of a pontifical high mass mirror imperial ceremonial, with possibly some later Gallican additions from, you guessed it, our friend Charlemagne. As a great Anglican Benedictine writer, Dom Gregory Dix, put it in his great book on the Christian liturgy, it is because it, the Holy Mass, became embedded deep down in the life of the Christian peoples, colouring all the vitae vitae of the ordinary man and woman, marking its personal turning points, marriage, sickness, death, and the rest, running through it year by year with the feasts and fasts and rhythm of the Sundays, that the Eucharistic action became inextricably woven into the public history of the Western world. The thought of it is inseparable. For its great turning points also, Pope Leo doing this thing, this sacramental action of the Mass, in the morning before he went out to daunt Attila on the day that saw the continuity of Europe saved. Another Leo doing this 3.5 centuries later, when he crowned Charlemagne as Roman Emperor at St. Peter's in Rome. Or again, Alfred, wandering defeated by the Danes, staying his soul on this liturgy, while medieval England struggled to be born. At Constantinople they do this still with identical words and gestures, which they used while the silver trumpets of the Basileus still called across the Bosphorus in what now seems to us this strangely fairy tale world of the Byzantine Empire. And in the 20th century, Charles de Foucault, in his hermitage in the Sahara, did this with the same liturgical rite as Cuthbert, 12 centuries before, had done it in his hermitage on Lindisfarne in the northern seas. The classical thing became the Roman imperial thing, which became the Catholic thing, which became the European thing. For wine is intrinsically necessary to the Catholic religion and its liturgical practice, not only is its use attested to and hallowed by references in Scripture, but the centrepiece of each Catholic's life, the Mass, could not be celebrated without it. And for where the church goes, the vine goes. A lot of the earliest estates growing wine in New Zealand, Australia, America, North and South, and even South Africa began under ecclesiastical aegis to produce wine for the Mass, and after the Mass for the priest's refreshment. And the same is no doubt true in earlier centuries when the faith spread across Eastern Europe and to places farther afield. And indeed, for a brief while, amidst the aridity and desolation of Tamrasanet, amidst the Sahara, where Charles de Foucault was as a hermit, vines grew. He was an ex-aristocratic playboy, an ex-French hussar, and he raised those vines. As a priest, he knew he needed wine for Mass, and supplies from the nearest French garrison could not be relied upon because of banditry and brigandage. Even if they had been reliable, Blessed Charles saw the importance of growing grapes around his hermitage. It is appropriate for the dwelling of a priest to be surrounded by the drooping clusters and gentle tendrils of the vine. Though man made wine, I think God made it too. God, making all things, made man make good wine. He taught him how the little tendrils twine about the stakes of labour, close and true. And then next, with intimate prophetic laughter, he taught the man, in his own image blessed, to pluck and wagon and to all the rest, to tread the grape and work his vintage after. So did God make us, making good wines makers. So did he order us to rule the field. And now, by God, are we not only bakers, but vintners also, sacraments to yield, yet most of all strong lovers. Praised be to God, who taught us how the winepress should be trod. And let us not forget that Belloc also had a habit of baptizing his wine. All, nearly all, red wine is the better for having just 1 or 2 drops of water poured into the first glass only. Why this should be, I know not, but so it is. It introduces it. This admirable and little-known custom is called baptizing wine. Now, the ecclesiastical traditions, of course, extend beyond wine. Dom Perignon was said to be the first person properly to develop manageable fermentation of wine in a bottle, although it's hotly contested by the monks of Limoux in the Languedoc, where they make their rightly lauded sparkling wine called Blanquette. The monks of Belgium are particularly noted for brewing, and so strong are some of these Trappist ales that there's no wonder that the monks are speechless. Then there are the liqueurs, Chartreuse, Frigolet, a little-known pre-Monstratensian liqueur from Provence, and Benedictine, and of course the fabled arquebus that Belloc used to talk about, which possibly existed or not. Distillation itself was developed in monastic houses, because the church was for a long while the guardian of science and its foremost proponent. The Cistercian houses up the north of England refined metalworking skills which allowed Henry VIII, ironically of all people, to cast larger and more reliable cannon. Now, wine and religion have a relationship which predated the church. I've already mentioned Belloc imitating the actions of a Roman soldier, or perhaps a Greek before him, or a Phoenician, pouring out an offering upon the deck of the Nona. The legions carried the vine wherever they went. They required wine for the oath-taking of new recruits, which they called the sacramentum, from where we derive our word sacrament. So wine as an accompaniment to religious ritual is particularly prevalent in the works of Virgil. And of course, the works of Virgil are works that Belloc held very closely to his heart. And the wine that was poured out in oblation, when it's referenced in those works, was said to be the very god himself, Bacchus Linnaeus. Now, in the Catholic Mass, the wine is transubstantiated into Christ's blood shed for all men. Christ the vine, and thus the grape, trod upon in the winepress of the Passion to provide new wine to sanctify the holy people of God. In that sense, wine becomes God, and the classical and the Christian unite. And in drinking it, his blood, we ourselves share in that divinity. And so, in that goblet, that glass that you or I can hold, that we can share with family and friends, wine encapsulates so much of Belloc, because it encapsulates so much of the West and of the European thing, those traditions and the history he loved, whose culture he defended, and which he himself had inherited, desired to see passed on. It truly is leading all creation down distilled to one small ardent sphere immensely filled. In that goblet, perhaps, lies the Belloc that all of us can see. Had these been mine, Ausonian muse, to know the large, contented oxen heaving slow, to count my sheaves at harvest, so to spend perfected days in peace until the end, with every evening's dust of gold to hear the bells upon the pasture height, the clear full horn of herdsmen gathering in the kine to ancient byres in hamlets Apennine, and crown abundant age with generous ease. Had these, Ausonian muse, had these, but since I would not, since I could not stay, let me remember, even in this my day, how, when the ephemeral vision's lure is past, all must face their passion at the last. Was there not one that did to heaven complain, how driving through the midnight and the rain he struck the Atlantic seethe and surge before, wrecked in the north along a lonely shore to make the lights of home and hear his name no more? Was there not one that from a desperate field rode with no guerdon but a rifted shield, a name disherited, a broken sword, wounds unrenowned, battle beneath no lord, strong blows but on the void, and toil without reward? When from the waste of such long labour done, I too must leave the grape ennobling sun, and like the vineyard worker, take my way down the long shadows of declining day, bend on the sombre plain my clouded sight, and leave the mountain to the advancing night, come to the term of all that was mine own with nothingness before me, and alone. Then to what hope of answer shall I turn? Comrade commander, whom I dared not earn, what said you then to trembling friends and new? A moment, and I drink it with you new, but in my Father's kingdom. So, my friend, let not your cup desert me in the end. But when the hour of mine adventures near, just and benignant, let my youth appear, bearing a chalice, open, golden, wide, with benediction graven on its side. So touch my dying lip, so bridge that deep, so pledge my waking from the gift of sleep, and sacramental raise me the divine, strong brother in God, and last companion, wine.
I have to say that listening to Mike is a bit like drinking from the very best bottle of wine. Something rich and fathomable and slightly intoxicating. Really was extraordinary. Thanks again, Mike. And just one little point. You mentioned Belloc when he left Parliament, saying he was glad to be quit the dirtiest company he'd ever kept. That was actually a speech he made in Worthing. There you are. That's interesting.